Hello, and greetings from the University of Notre Dame Press. I'm Catherine Pitts, the Marketing and Publicity Director at the Press, and we are so excited to be here today under the auspices of our Books for Better Understanding author event series and the Notre Dame Press Book Festival, which is occurring virtually November 10 through 11 this year. Today's featured authors are Nancy Cavadini and Cecilia Davis Cunningham, whose book, Stories in Light, A Guide to the Stained Glass of the Basilica at the University of Notre Dame, was published by Notre Dame Press in 2020. Mrs. Cavadini and Cunningham will be talking about the fascinating history behind the stained glass windows and how you, as a visitor to the Basilica or as a worshiper, can increase your understanding and appreciation of the extraordinary collection of French stained glass that is housed on the Notre Dame campus. I'd like to start by introducing Nancy Cavadini. She received her graduate degree in theology at Marquette University and has served in religious formation for the Congregation of Holy Cross and as an ecumenical and interfaith officer. Her co-author is Cecilia Davis Cunningham, who received her graduate degree in art history from Florida State University. Ms. Cunningham became a tour guide at the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in 1999. Her years of teaching have allowed her to introduce numerous visitors to the art and history of the Basilica. Thank you for being here today, Nancy and Cecilia.
Thank you.
The first question is for Nancy. In Stories in Light, you explain how Father Sorin played a major part in securing the stained glass windows and bringing them to Notre Dame. Father Sorin was a member of the Congregation of Holy Cross in France before he left Europe in 1841 for Northern Indiana, where he founded the University of Notre Dame. Father Sorin was a visionary priest and leader. Nancy, what can you tell us about the early days of the university, the Congregation of Holy Cross, and Father Sorin's inspiration for the Basilica and the stained glass windows?
Well, looking at the Basilica stained glass windows will certainly give you a sense of the early history of Notre Dame. After all, a church's stained glass windows tend to reflect local or national concerns, particular artistic tastes, and interest in particular saints. If you go into the Basilica and walk around, you'll immediately know that Notre Dame's Basilica is not a 21st century church. There's no Oscar Romero and no Teresa of Calcutta. What do we find? Well, the windows are fascinating to look at, and looking at them teaches us about what nourished the faith and the education of the Notre Dame students who went before us 150 years ago. Father Sorin, a Holy Cross priest, along with the Holy Cross brothers who accompanied him, founded Notre Dame in 1842. They came to Indiana as a missionary band, for Indiana was missionary territory at that time. Their hearts were set on establishing a Catholic school, a main focus of the Congregation of the Holy Cross. Of course, the Holy Cross community was founded in response to the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, education in France was available almost solely through religious institutions. These educational structures were dismantled by the Revolution, and the educational chaos which followed that eventually caused religious communities to spring up in France in response to this lack of education. These new religious communities, including the Congregation of Holy Cross, were certain that the best education was the one given not by a secular institution, but one given in a religious environment. As Father Blant says, who has written a new book out by Notre Dame Press on the history of Notre Dame, he says, "It is not inaccurate to say that without the French Revolution in the 1790s, there would be no University of Notre Dame in the 1840s. Totally true. And you can see it in the windows. So Notre Dame was established using what the Holy Cross community knew, the world of 19th century French spirituality and education. Father Sorin filled Notre Dame's church with all the stuff of the French spirituality which he knew, which he was convinced would convey the Catholic faith to those who worshiped there, especially the students. The stained glass windows he had made by the glassworks of Le Mans, France, the birthplace of the Holy Cross community, by a glassworks named the Carmel du Mans, that is, the Carmelite convent of Le Mans, France. Father Sorin had been friends with this community of Carmelites, whose cloister, a strictly cloistered convent, was located just down the street from the Holy Cross community. By way of a series of incredible circumstances, this cloistered convent, cut off from the world, began making stained glass windows. So when Father Sorin needed windows, he ordered them from the Carmel du Mans, and he had them shipped to Notre Dame, Indiana. You can read about this in the book. These are the beautiful windows we see today in the Basilica. Stained glass is a thoroughly French art. It is also a quintessentially religious art. If Father Sorin wished to inspire and educate those who entered Notre Dame's church, the stained glass was a particularly perfect medium for religious education. Art makes the invisible perceptible. And because the experience of stained glass is the experience of light, which is invisible, passing through painted glass and becoming visible in human images, it is the particularly perfect medium for understanding what the incarnation is. We could even say that the very experience of stained glass holds a kind of awareness of the incarnation. The stained glass windows of Notre Dame's Basilica hold in their images the world of 19th century French spirituality and tell us of the great hopes Father Sorin had about the faith and educational mission of Notre Dame. I hope you have a chance to go in and let them speak to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. That was a fascinating historical background of the windows and the Basilica. The next question is for Cecilia. The Basilica of the Sacred Heart at Notre Dame contains one of the largest collections of late 19th century French stained glass outside of France. And this is fascinating to me that this collection resides on our campus, especially in light of the massive fire that ravaged the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris just a year and a half ago. Cecilia, as an art historian, can you explain how stained glass is made and then talk a bit about the glasswork in France where the stained glass windows were created?
Yes, I would love to. Well, a 19th century stained glass window was not just made to be made. They were commissions. It's an architectural art. They were made for very specific structures and very specific sizes. So nothing was made before the commission was achieved and the subject matters had been decided. The first step was making small scale sketches out of watercolor to give the person doing the commission an idea of what it would look like overall. Then, once commission is in hand, cartoons were created for the entire window. This indicated all details, including the colors named for each piece of glass. These cartoons, once they had them, could be used over and over in our own basilica. When you're visiting, notice in the nave, St. Jerome, and across the nave, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, and then of St. Joachim in the sanctuary, are all made from the same cartoon with various details. So the full-size cartoon was a very detailed plan, but could be altered in some ways and used over and over. Now, something distinct on the cartoon was the heavy dark lines, which separated each piece of glass. The line was the size of a lead cane, C-A-M-E. Cames are the lead channels in the shape of the capital letter H turned to its side so that the pieces of glass can be slid in from each direction and thus joined to create a whole image. They had scissors that cut the black leaded lines to an exact size, so there would be no mistakes. The cartoon then had to be enlarged to the exact size. Now remember, some of these windows are 40 feet by 30 feet. They're very large. And then the glass would be cut out by glass cutters. Now, please note the glass cutters were different from the glass makers because the many different types of glass that could be made by the mid-19th century were made by various workshops and companies around France. There's many different types of glass. At this point then, the glass painters, who were the Carmelite sisters early on, they did this for over 20 years, from 1830 to about, 1873, all details such as faces, clothing, buildings, landscapes, grasses were painted with metal oxides on the glass. These pieces would then be passed back to the factory workers so that this painting on the glass could be made permanent by firing in the furnace. Now, kiln operators, of course, were not the glass cutters or the glass painters. These were technicians who were highly skilled in firing for the different effects on glass to make it permanent. So it involved time, reaching temperatures, maintaining temperatures for different effects for long periods of time, and then what kind of firing atmosphere. Everyone had their job, in other words. But also, there's something that needs to be noted here. Some before, some after the firings. The Carmelite sisters had hired very skilled workers to work for them. And there were two brothers, these German Kuckelbecker brothers, who had developed many techniques. The nun's glass became famous for the Carmen technique, but no one knows how it was done. This is not unusual in the history of stained glass because the artists would not pass on their knowledge of their particular techniques to others. And that knowledge simply died with them. That's in the history of stained glass. Also, some colors were created with silver stain and acid baths. And it's an acid technique in which they place it on the back side of glass, in particular, white glass or clear glass. You can make a range from very deep oranges to pale oranges to brilliant yellows, pale yellows, lemon yellows, and even transparent yellows. For example, on the cover of our book, the window that is in the Lady Chapel, that is of the homage to Sacré-Cœur in Paris, uses all of these techniques. Now, for instance, blue glass, you may etch blue glass and produce many shades of green from blue glass. And for instance, in the Agony in the Garden in the Lady Chapel, there are 14 different shades of green in that glass. You can understand why they were so celebrated. Then the glass pieces, once they were fired and completed, the acid bath completed, they were put together with cement pressed down into the lead channels to keep and make it permanent to the weather, and put into manageable panels. Maybe 10 panels could make a window. Then these window panels are all boxed up, crated, and sent to the various places, and with instructions. The instructions were sent to the laborers who would then assemble the windows at Notre Dame. So now that's basically how a 19th century stained glass window is made. But the Carmel Dumont glassworks themselves was a Carmelite order who was founded in the suburb of Le Mans and about 1830. And they, at one point, needed to build a chapel, and they have to borrow money. So the Carmelites had run out of money when they were building the chapel. They couldn't buy any leaded glass windows. A famous priest, Father Lotin, who was a famous iconographer and also worked for the diocese and quite the administrator, suggested the women make their own. He convinced them they could do it. And so the Holy Cross, the owners of the University of Notre Dame, the Congregation of Holy Cross, had at one time made a furnace and tried to make their own stained glass, only, you know, they weren't very good. So they stopped doing it. But the nuns asked Father Moreau, the founder of the CSC, if they could use his furnace and tools and whatever glass he had. And he said, yes, as long as you take care of it. Only these were cloistered nuns with little contact with the outside world. However, they did something very smart. They employed excellent artists and skilled workmen in glass. The nuns became the glass painters doing the detailed work. And you have to realize these are not uneducated women or women without any skill. And all of these women had early schooling, and they painted, they embroidered, and they did needlepoint. They could design canvases. So they were quite artistic, and they achieved success right away. They began to win gold medals around France and also other places in Europe. And what this means commercially, lots of orders. They flourished so that they paid off all their debts. They paid off other Carmel's debts, and it became too much work for them. So in 1873, even though the head nun, Mother Eleanor, had contracted with Father Sorin to make the windows, they sold it to her nephew, which is the Rathuis, which you see in some of the windows, and then to Ferdinand Houchet, who was one of their early directors, and finally Houchet and Son. And the glassworks closed in 1903 with the death of Houchet's son.
Fascinating. I had no idea that there were that many different technicians and artists involved in the design and the production
Oh, yes.
in glass windows. Our next question is for Nancy. Stories in Light is a very interesting book in terms of teaching readers how to experience images. This is really an intriguing idea to me. Can you explain the process in more detail?
Well, sure. Because stained glass is a particularly French art, I'm sure Father Sorin would never have built a church without stained glass windows. Of course, the important role of art in religious education at that time was a subject that every French Catholic loved to discuss, and Father Sorin was no exception. So after much discussion, he came to an agreement with the Carmel Dumont on what they were going to present in the Basilica. They had a plan for the windows, and it was this. The narthex, the entrance to the Basilica, kind of like a little lobby, was to be what they said was a meditation on the mercy of God, and was meant to orient us to be able to enter the church correctly with the right spirit. The nave, where the worshipers are, where we go when we go there for church, is a meditation on the lives of the saints. The transept, which intersects the church, is a meditation on what the church is. The sanctuary windows, where the altar is reserved for the most august saints. So there are saints as in the nave, but the most august saints, meaning those who lived at the very earliest days of the church. And then there's further windows behind the altar. They're called chapel windows, and they're meditations on particular devotions within the church. The Rosary, the Immaculate Conception. Go and look at them. But maybe the best way to think about this is to look at one of the Basilica's very first stained glass windows. It's located in the narthex. Here there are two windows. One depicts purgatory and the other depicts the Last Judgment. The idea behind this is to make the viewer, on entering the church, think about the meaning of their life, sort of to put things in perspective, as we would say today. So let's look at the Last Judgment. It's the window that's on the west side in the narthex. So on the east is purgatory, where the sun is coming up, and on the west is the Last Judgment, where the sun goes down at the end of the day. Now, this is an amazing scene. Christ is at the top, seated on a cloud. The cross is at his side. His right hand is raised above those on his right, who seem unafraid and hopeful. Those on his left, with his lowered left hand, they look like they're in anguish. The angel in the middle of the scene has blown the trumpet for the Last Judgment and has set it down. If we follow the angel's trumpet down the scene, it draws our attention to someone prone across the bottom of the window. A hand is reaching up and has grabbed his tie, his cravat, and is pulling him down into the flames there, in the flames in the bottom right corner. Christ himself glances down at this prone man, and sort of by his glance and the trumpet movement of the trumpet, both of those draw our eye down to where this man is. The man fiercely glances in the direction of the flames. But let's notice a detail that will help us understand this window. What's perched on the ear of this poor man? It's a quill pen. He's a writer of some kind and is being dragged into the flames. That's kind of interesting in an educational setting. This is an introductory window to an educational institution. And to help us to understand this, I'm going to give you a quote from Father Soren. "Modern incredulity," he said, "is the noticeable feature of our times. Atheism is spreading in all directions, carried wide and high by two powerful wings, the secular school and the press." So here's the writer, and that's who he is. He works from the secular point of view, which of course we saw with the French Revolution. Secular education was being promoted, whereas Notre Dame was not interested in secular education, but the religiously focused education. This window sets the scene for the viewer to enter the nave and to begin to look at the beautiful stained glass that depicts the saints. If you open the door and go inside, what do you find? The nave windows portray 40 saints found in 10 windows. 6 windows contain female saints and 4 windows contain male saints. So interestingly, there's more women saints than men saints, 24 women and 16 men. Of the men, only one is a pope and only one is a king, but there are 4 queens. This is maybe not what we expected. At least in fairness, it should have been half and half. Probably this imbalance is due to the great respect for women in the 19th century in the Catholic Church and the conviction that the feminine was closer to the divine. The educational pedagogy found in the Basilica's stained glass windows are for you. The goal of the Basilica windows is to provide you with a pedagogy in light. The goal is to draw the viewer into a consideration of how faith and education are invaluable in a person's formation. Father Soren once explained that Notre Dame's education was the forming of the man, and of course Notre Dame was all men's school at that point, the forming of the citizen, and the forming of the future saint. So I hope this helps you to think more about these windows.
Thanks, Nancy. That was really an interesting analysis of that window. I enjoyed that. Okay, the next question is for Cecilia. You were recently interviewed by the South Bend Tribune about your book, and you said you can learn something new every time you go to the Basilica. Can you explain about the method for looking at stained glass windows?
Yes, I would like to do that. I think I'm going to use the Pentecost window, which is a transept window in the Basilica. It's on the east side. And remember, this is architectural. It fills the space, and one of its purposes is to let in light, but let in glorious light. I always tell people to go to the Basilica on overcast days if they ever have the chance, because the windows are more vivid on overcast days than on sunny days. When the sun comes through, it casts the light of various colors all over the walls. And also it's really interesting to see the Basilica from the outside at night, in which you are overwhelmed by the reds, really brilliant reds and yellows and gold. It's worth an excursion. But when you are in and walking around, visitors have told me they're confused when they're looking at the Pentecost window. Okay, it's very large and there's so much action going on in it. The window is in the shape of a large pointed arch, but a scene as if we have thrown open the shutters of our bedroom window and looked out at the world. Now, what we see is a very large open room of great depth and an open loggia where we see the sky in the distant background. We aren't, remember, we're looking at it. We aren't in the space. We're invited into the space by the figure of St. Peter, who is in the bottom left foreground in yellow and green. This is called the sacred conversation in art. He invites us into the scene. He doesn't look at the center of the scene. He doesn't look at the action that's going on, but rather at us, the viewer. And he brings us into the scene, not by just looking at us, but by the open stance of his body. His feet point toward us, one hand and arm points toward us. It's a very open position to bring you into the picture. He carries us to the figure behind him, who is in a bright red and blue. And alongside the picture frame is a red column, which brings you into the red curtains above and beyond him. The color red becomes a directional force. The red column to those red curtains, to the angels above in the highlights, to the very highest point of the arch. The red at the very top point highlights an angel holding a banner that proclaims Ave Maria, Hail Mary. The red of the angels and the decorations in that very top area is also surrounded in a dark black line. This is the stone tracery, and under the angel, as if she points to it, is God the Son and God the Father. The heart encircles them and brings us then to the right side of the picture, and you see the highlights of red, and it continues on down to the capitals of the building, to the saints kneeling there in red, the red column along the right side, all the way down to the saint kneeling on the ground in the bottom right. Notice the position of the legs and how the red color forces us to look to the red kneeling saint in the center. Here, it becomes the line that focuses on the figure in the center, the central figure, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and she sits before the red curtain of honor. She's centered. Now, her center position is emphasized by this punctuation of bright light right over her head. It's the Holy Spirit as a white dove in a pale blue sky with white clouds in a direct line from Ave Maria, God the Father, God the Son, to the Holy Ghost, to Mary. The color green around her is also used to give emphasis, to stop there and to be calm. They use the green color with the red color to actually give great impetus to that part of the scene. It's the rhythm there. Red and green are complementary colors. They intensify each other. Think Christmas, red meat up against green wavy paper at the supermarket, make it look redder, the meat. One can see the green color carry us from the bottom figures. Look at St. Peter, the other saint. They curve into the figure and the tablecloth on either side of Mary, two gentle curves that brings us right back to the figure of Mary. Everything in this action tells us we are looking at the Pentecost, the subject of the window. That is the manifestation of the Holy Spirit beginning the age of the visible church in the world. It is one of the most important feast days that occurs 50 days after Easter. The happening took place, according to the book of Acts, filled by a strong driving wind and tongues of fire came to rest on Mary, the apostles, and the first followers of Christ. They were to go to all nations spreading the gospel. Art tells us it can be nothing else but the Pentecost.
Thank you. That was wonderful. That is such a beautiful window. I could look at it for hours.
I agree.
All right, Nancy, when I was talking with you and Cecilia, when you were trying to decide which of your favorite saints depicted in the stained glass windows that you wanted to discuss today, you both came up with a list that was far too long for this interview. There was St. Ursula, St. Isidore the Farmer, St. Sebastian with arrows shot in him, King Louis IX, St. Dominic, and the list goes on. But Nancy, you chose one of the saints in the nave, Queen Clotilde, wife of Clovis, who you thought would bring to light a number of important issues in French history and the French nature of the windows.
Yes, Saint Clotilde. Queen Clotilde is one of my favorite windows in the nave. Each window has its particular beauty. If you spend time with a window, you'll find details that just speak to you. For example, I love the peaceful look on the face of the woman who personifies the church in the transept's ecclesia window. You would never know that the Catholic Church had just lost its extensive land holdings and that Vatican I had been abruptly closed due to the seizure of the Vatican States. So why does she, that little detail, why does she have that peaceful look on her face? It's a good question as you look at that window and think about it. Saint Clotilde, she's presented to us as a queen because she was a queen. She was the wife of King Clovis, who unified what is now France. He was the first French king. But his importance is that as king, he converted from Arianism to Catholicism. So as the first king of France, he made all of France Catholic. And so from him comes the rich French Catholicism that Father Sorin and the Holy Cross brought to Notre Dame. Incidentally, you can find the Baptism of Clovis on Christmas Day in 496 in one of the transept windows. If you just go around the corner from St. Clovis, you'll see the baptism window below the evangelist Mark, and there is King Clovis being baptized. Why not do a window for Clovis in the nave? Why do we have a window to St. Clotilde? Because Clotilde, along with St. Genevieve, who also can be found in one of the nave windows, were responsible for the conversion of Clovis. She is the wife who converted her husband and a nation. Saint Clotilde is a very important saint in the French world. For the students, the male students and at Notre Dame and the female students at St. Mary's, she was a saint to admire. We find her standing in her glass niche, dressed as royalty, with various bright colors, gold embroidered trim, and a fur-lined mantle. She wears a gold crown. She looks out at us. What is the look on her face? If we look closer, we see her left hand turned outward so that her wedding band is visible. This is Clotilde's particular detail that I love, like the look on the face of the church in the ecclesia window. Her wedding band turned out so that we can admire it and know of her importance. Clotilde was considered a saint also because of her charity to the poor and sick, her generosity to the church in founding churches and monasteries. She was also known for her life of prayer, and below this window is a small scene that portrays her at prayer in a chapel. The nave is filled with French saints. Clotilde is one example, but there are many others. There are, of course, saints that are not French, but the saints that fill the nave reveal the world of Notre Dame's founders in all its richness and complexity. Father Sorin was certain that the French Catholic faith he brought with his fellow religious would provide Indiana with the religion, education, and culture it needed. Beginning with St. Genevieve at the entrance to the nave, French history and faith runs like a golden thread through the windows and includes, for instance, Louis IX, as well as Louis XIII in the chapel found in the chapel found behind the altar, but also you can see that in the penultimate window, the homage of France to the Sacred Heart. Portrayed in that window is the Church of Sacré-Cœur in Paris. It's on the cover of the book. That church was still under construction when Notre Dame's window went in, portraying that window in 1884. So I invite you to go take a look around the church and see all the French saints and images and history that is available in the windows.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. So Nancy and then Cecilia, I wonder if you could talk about how your book, which discusses stained glass windows in the Basilica that are over 150 years old, how your book and research matter for today's students and for future generations at Notre Dame.
Well, I went into this project thinking I knew all I needed to know to understand those windows. And I was wrong, you know, and I was humbled by the stunning evidence of a vibrant late 19th century community of faith. It teaches you a lot to find that in windows that are 150 years old. I hope future generations will have the same wonderful experience when they're drawn to the windows.
Cecilia?
Well, I think about it, and as Nancy, I've learned so much more about saints than I ever knew. But at the same time, I see their value for us today. They're very teaching and they're very devoted to service. And they bear meaning for us today as Christians, as Catholics, especially. So I suggest you go in and you visit with the saints. You visit with the windows and love the glory of them. Saints and windows.
Well, I want to thank you, Nancy and Cecilia, for participating and being here today and speaking with us. It was a real treat talking to you, and thank you for your insight. And thank you for your beautiful book, Stories in Light, A Guide to the Stained Glass Windows at the Basilica of the University of Notre Dame. The book is available at the Hannes Notre Dame bookstore on campus, where there are a number of autographed copies by both of you, or the book can be ordered through Notre Dame Press, through the Notre Dame Press website at unvpress.nd.edu. Thanks again, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.